to understand news in languages that I do not know and to purify style or vocabulary mistakes when I write some text in a non-maternal language. In general, I make use of the Yandex and Google to save time. It is a fact that, thanks to these tools, you can advance quite a lot when it comes to translating and, in addition, some of the proposed translation equivalences can solve the occasional translation problem, or at least give you some idea. Normally, by way of comparison, I usually look for combinations of fixed words, which, often, are difficult to find in dictionaries. My field is the phraseology, and it is interesting to observe that some combinations appear and others do not. The TA does not guarantee that the proposed translation is the most optimal, but that is where the user's criticism capacity comes into play and knowing in which translation context the unit in question is inserted.
I do not use TA usually except in the case of searching words, like a dictionary. Normally, I only use automatic translation to translate languages that I don't know. In the case of those that I do know, like English, I only turn to them when the English concealer did not have clear my doubts about the correction of a word or phrase. I use machine translation to translate letters, emails, conference summaries or briefing professionals from Spanish and Catalan into English. In the first three cases, with my knowledge of English and the translation, it is enough to give it good. When it comes to broader reports, I need someone to know more English, to make a formal review. I use DeepL and Google Translator. In my teaching task, I often find myself using an automatic translator to understand the structure or vocabulary that I find a writing, an exercise, a wording, of a student. The strangeness of the word, it alone or in the context, or of the syntactic structure, suggests that the student has used an automatic translator. In these cases, I take advantage of the errors to show growth problems of the linguistic combination or characteristics of the Arabic. Personally, I also use automatic translators, especially to review texts or to find the right word in their context. I use automatic translation to send emails, basically. My English language skills are limited and online automatic translation programs allow me to quickly obtain an English version of my text, in Catalan or Spanish. Although then I check to validate that the translation does not sound like talking Hindi, saves me a long time, in general. I assure myself that I have not put any Castilian or Catalanism and that the message I want to convey is as understandable as possible. Prior to automatic translation, this task could take a long time to search for the appropriate words in the paper dictionary, and always had the doubt whether the grammatical construction was correct. I am not a translator, but often, in the context of my teaching and research work, I read documents in other languages, especially in English. The translator helps me when I do not understand a text well or to expand an idea. Likewise, I support the translator to write first versions of my texts that will be published in other languages. The translator that I use is DeepL.
I am not a professional translator, but in my daily routine I use automatic translators, such as Google Translator or Deep Translator. I usually use the first to solve quick doubts when I am reading a document in another language, usually English or French. I also use it to seek the meaning of words used in the foreign press on the internet. I consult daily newspapers such as Le Monde or Il Corriere della Sera, as well as audiovisual media websites such as the BBC or the CNN. As for the second, DeepL, I use it rather to translate academic texts and also to make the draft of some, which I translate from Spanish into English. I do this, for example, with articles from specialized journals, often to write abstracts, or communications that I have to present at some international congress, as well as to elaborate the English version of teaching guides, for example, or other university texts. Sporadically I also use the sopcatala.org platform, although less frequently.
Normally I use simultaneous translator for my usual communications. For very specific cases, contract translation of the text. I do not send video because I have not registered any for this occasion. Yes, in some interventions in Congress I have recorded some.
Yes, I usually use automatic translation. I previously used Google Translator, but now I use the reverse, which I find much better, at least as regards the translation of Arabic. I also use it for English, Russian, especially to check, make sure if my translation is corrector. For English I also use the translator. For Catalan use I use the Soft Català translator. In the case of Soft Català, I also use it as a corrector. Apart from using it for my own translations, I also use them for the following issues. Tourist issues, that is, if I find myself in a country whose language I do not know, I find the automatic translator useful, either to communicate orally or to copy information and translate it. In cases of looking for some summary or some other information about a book that is not translated into any of the languages I know. Information about movies. Information of matters relations with medicine. For unofficial communication matters. For what purpose? To facilitate the work or issues that interest me. How? I copy the information and hit the translator.
Soc un usuari habitual de la traducció automàtica, especialment quan m'interessa informar-me de coses que succeeixen en llocs molt llunyans. És una manera d'acostar-me a les fonts d'informació més primàries, en mesura que això és possible. I sobretot quan es tracta de llengües que són llunyanes o llengües que desconec.
I use it often and for different purposes. If I systematize them with rigor, I would find dozens of examples of a dynamic that, for me, has standardized in the last decade. I use automatic translators as a tool that facilitates everyday management. To solve certain doubts that arise when I communicate with friends, and also with co-workers. To confirm if the fragment I am writing or thinking of a foreign language would be formulated similarly to the different automatic translation platforms. To capture the main idea of an article written in a language that I do not master, like Italian, for example. To help answer the question of this form, etc., etc. The results of automatic translations must always be polished for us. If the doubt has a deeper scope and the communication provides for more technical components, I also use softwares, such as the Sketch Engine, which combine statistics with grammatical patterns and, among other things, are extractors of placements. I usually use automatic translators from Portuguese to the meta-language. But in cases where I do not trust much in the translation of the Portuguese, I change the starting language. I also have to often change a set of elements of the starting language. For example, in Portuguese we often use the passive voice. When I want to obtain a translation into English, for example, I avoid the reiteration of this structure. So, then, I change the logic of my own language. The same goes for another example, with subordinate or coordinated sentences, which have a different weight in the various languages. Finally, there is a plurality of conceptual, articulatory and syntactic elements that distinguish languages and that invite us to a specific treatment of the text that will be translated and, of course, the results of automatic translations. It seems to me, for all this, that the combination of technologies, which are, in their own way, very human, and the hesitant, which is even more human, benefits us all. Sometimes I look for information from different types in languages that I do not know and I need to use automatic translators. These translation systems have improved significantly in recent years, but they are still very deficient, at least transferring to Spanish. In fact, I prefer to translate into English. I cannot assess the quality of the translation, but, at least, I find out what is said. A curious fact that has happened to me with the Google Translator, which is the most used for comfort, is that it can translate the same fragment when it passes more than once. A few years ago I tutoring a TFG about Spanish automatic translation. The student analyzed the operation of Sistran, reverse, free translation, Google, and its auxili automaticoa. The latter is still in a very incipient state. The labor languages were Spanish, English, German, and Basque, combined with each other, and several linguistic problems were addressed: the translation of polysemic words, sayings, false friends, idioms, and the order of the phrase. The results were irregular, depending on the languages, the treated problem and the applied translator, but in no case were they satisfactory. From my personal experience and the results of the TFG, it is evident that automatic translators are not fully reliable. They can be another tool that the translator, person, in his work, but the review and correction of the text obtained is inevitable. What will happen in the future? Can you replace automatic translation into human translation? Can they contribute the linguistic wealth that a human being possesses? Is it possible to automate creativity?
I use the TA for multiple functions, between nearby languages that I know, it is, CA, in, to save time to type, or to have a first version to base me, or as inspiration when I am looking for alternatives to say something. I also use it as a teacher between and is to check the version given by the automatic translator. The TA has definitely changed the way of looking for potential texts for evaluation. They have to be texts with problems that an automatic translator does not easily solve, so that the student does not feel tempted to copy and paste, and post it minimally, the version that facilitates it. TA is to use it, and it would be strange to prohibit students from using it. But the teacher, if he is evaluating the ability to translate a student, and not the ability to post it, should not have to correct or evaluate what DeepL or Google has done, but what the student has done. I recognize what I use to understand everything that is not in languages other than English. I have used it to translate from the Ukrainian, for example. Also employment to translate administrative texts into English.
Good morning. The question almost would be for the fact that I do not use automatic translation, because it is true that in recent years implicit or explicit automatic translation tools accompany me on the way as a research, but also in use as a consumer of content of social networks and platforms. As a research, it allows me diagonally to texts not written in English and that I was likely to be more difficult. As a consumer, the tools integrated on Twitter or YouTube allow me to follow, for example, the Ukraine conflict or the denialist theories about COVID-19. It increases my plurality without affecting my digital diet.